Bing bang it bing 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 da da bing 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 ba da 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 ba ba da 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 ba da ba bing.
Just let those beans that I know on Bean Radio. Let those beans take control of my heart. If you're down on the bone, or as rich of a duck as they come, my poor pot break apart. Well, don't let my pot, well, don't let my pot, well, don't let my potty pop break apart. The click of the Cameron.
The click of the Cameron.
Okay, well, we can do right about now. Beans. Bean Radio. This is still Ellis.
This is still Ellis.
I'm still Gibson. So we thought that we would talk about an art topic because we are both interested in the arts. And one of the things that I worked at a comic book store for many years, and I was listening to a comic podcast called Dirty Old Ladies, which is a great podcast. It's the only comic podcast I've listened to an episode of because all the other ones were incredibly disinteresting. But that's just my opinion. There might be some great ones, especially now. That was a few years ago. But they mentioned Craft is the Enemy, which is sort of semi-famous, I guess famous in professional cartoonist circles, exchange in a magazine called, I think, the Comic Journal. Yeah, it's just called the Comics Journal, which in the 90s was a print publication that was pretty widely published within, I guess, the small industry that is comic book stores. But in the 90s, for those who don't know, there was a huge comic boom. And there was a bit of a bust towards the end of the 90s. There was actually a lot of a bust towards the end of the 90s.
Yeah, it was pretty substantial. It was something that I perceived even just as like a surface level fan of comics at the time.
Yeah, so people in the industry at the time knew that it wasn't exactly healthy, and that's actually kind of what I think part of the impetus for James Kochalka's letter, which is what started the exchange, is actually the state of the industry, and he saw it and he recognized that it wasn't necessarily bringing itself a stunning future. And there's a lot in comic books that's sort of old guard or based on hero worship or just like straight up copying other artists because it's commercial art.
Yeah, generally with deadlines, which can stifle creativity a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, Wally Wood. There's a Wally Wood quote about don't draw it if you can trace it. Basically, he was just telling you to copy and trace as much as you could, or use photographs, or do whatever you could to get the assignment done, because comics are a lot about meeting deadlines. A lot of the people who end up working for Marvel and DC do good work. They go on deadline.
And then the quality starts to degrade.
Well, yeah, there's like 3 things that you can get 2 of. I forget the third one. You can be behind on your deadline if your work is fantastic and people love it. But if you're just doing sort of run-of-the-mill work, because some Marvel comics will have like 6 artists, if you're just doing run-of-the-mill contract work and people who don't know who you are, you're going to want to meet deadlines.
And this isn't just a thing in the United States or North American comics or Western comics. This is probably even more rampant in Japanese comic books. The deadlines are even worse sometimes, and you just see a lot of examples of scenes, entire like panels being more or less traced out of another person's work, and that's not even necessary. Like, that's not something that you'd be fired for. The use of references and like almost rotoscoping levels of tracing is fairly common as well.
Reuse of backdrops. A lot of cars, it's very regular in manga to just trace buses and cars and architecture and stuff.
And it's probably even more regular now.
Oh, I mean, it's
than it was when I realized this years and years ago, when I read about it, when I kept on seeing examples of it. It's even very I don't know. Animation used to be drawn by hand, and so a lot of the times they would just steal steal animation sequences for television shows. Naruto is really famous for doing that.
You're gonna want to move that mic a little fist closer to your face. There you go. Yeah, I know that some studios will reuse matte paintings and stuff like that, and so I guess that's what we're trying to get past. Is painters in the past had to paint portraits to survive, so it's not like that anyone's ever been free of the commercial aspect of art. But comic books, especially because it's mass-produced, and until very recently, it was difficult to self-distribute or self-publish.
Well, and you're also generally working with a group of people to create a product versus making something without deadlines on your own.
It used to take large teams of people to make comic books. You had to have color separators because of the printing process was laying differently colored dots on top of each other. So you had to have people who could do that quickly. And that's a pretty difficult thing to do. Well done color separation is quite the thing to behold, and it's a big difference from crappy color separation. And a lot of those people transitioned into being colorists when digital art became the norm in the 90s.
And you also didn't necessarily need this, but you would very frequently have people doing pencil work and then other people doing ink on the same panels. That was basically the norm for comic books. I think it just let you compartmentalize the work a little bit better and streamline everybody's output so that, well, that sounded very corporate, so that you could make products faster. Kind of like an assembly line for drawing people in skin-tight suits.
Yep. I think one thing about comics is that there was a well of talent to draw from. EC Comics pulled a bunch of art school graduates from Spain and some really exceptional artists, some of which later went on to Mad Magazine. So I think in the United States, as the illustration field sort of dwindled, partially because photography got better and better, a lot of comic publishers in the 50s, 60s, 70s had a lot of talent to pull from. So people who had good understandings of perspective, of anatomy, who could draw things from memory. And I think now that is less the case.
Well, that's definitely not the stuff that they were teaching when they created like the streamlined learn to draw comics, like actual schools of comics that produced a lot of the people who are working in the industry now.
Yeah,
there was like a whole glut of literature when I was young, like books produced by Marvel Comics or DC Comics that was teaching you to draw illustrations in the style and using the methods that they use to make them, and they either intentionally or unintentionally created like an art cult.
So
that way,
the Kubert school is the biggest comic school, and you just draw tons and tons and tons and tons of figures over and over and over again. You'll draw hundreds. That'll be the assignment. You'll have seconds to do the figures, and it's just so it encourages you to sort of draw a few character sets, a few character types, and use them repeatedly, which you see a lot of times in Kubert graduates. There's probably some Kubert School graduates who don't do that. I'm not actually actively aware of a lot of them. I think one of the people on the podcast I mentioned went to Kubert School. I could be wrong. I think that Amanda Palmer went to Kubert School. Amanda Palmer. Oh my gosh, I've been out of comics too long. I forgot she's done work with Jimmy Palmiotti, and she did one with Garth Ennis. I'll put it on the screen. But I think she's a Kubert School. So my basic issue with that type of work is that it's kind of like even more simplified cartooning. And I find a lot of times comic artists tend to have a few faces that they draw over and over and over again. And like Will Eisner didn't fall into this. So Will Eisner had like 40 faces he drew over and over again. And now I feel like there's a lot of artists who get away with 5.
I wonder if Will Eisner was more like doing caricatures of like people that actually existed. There's a lot of characterization inside of like in the faces in his work.
He was a trained painter. Yeah. And he had like an ethic that was related to his idea of patriotism. And so a lot of his work was during World War II, making a magazine which was basically a maintenance supplement for enlisted troops to tell them how to maintain their equipment. And then when he was working on The Spirit, he really pushed the boundaries of panel design and page layout to an extent that I don't think has been surpassed. There's been some good stuff since, but Will Eisner did it early and often and exceptionally well. And I'll show some of that. Do you want to get to the letter?
Sure.
Okay, so this is accessible on, I think it's the Comics Journal website. I could be wrong, but that will also be up. And the link will be in the description. I would encourage you to read this because I've left some of the replies that were less relevant out. But there's an exchange, and it's really good reading if you're into comics or if you're into art, because this was kind of the front lines of the at the time dominant like American art form. Comics are very tied to our national culture, especially in the 20th century. So
even more particularly now, when people have lost the attention span to read comics, so they've made them into movies. But I would also just argue that even if you aren't really interested in those things, it is interesting just to see how these types of communication used to play out before everybody was attached to like instantaneous social media. Like you would sometimes get like very interesting conversations out of people who are writing letters that they have to mail in or even just email. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to read this short introduction by the editors. The craft is the enemy debate, which ranged over several years, several issues, and several continents, began with a letter by James Kochalka, author of American Elf, in the Comics Journal number 189. In 2005, Kochalka would expand on his theory in the Cute Manifesto. Some readers found this letter inspirational. Others, notably Jim Woodring, wrote in refutations from Comics Journal, and this was in August 1996. Craft is the enemy. James Kochalka, Burlington, Vermont. I'm not exactly sure why I'm writing this letter, but I've been reading the Comics Journal number 188 for a couple hours now, and my mind has just been racing and blood pounding. My excitement with the power and possibilities of comics mixed with the fear of a royally screwed up marketplace, well, let's just say I've got a weird, shaky adrenaline rush. I just felt suddenly like I had to write and say, craft is the enemy. You could labor your whole life perfecting your craft, struggling to draw better, hoping one day to have the skills to produce a truly great comic. If this is how you're thinking, you will never produce this great comic, this powerful work of art that you dream of. There's nothing wrong with trying to draw well, but that is not of primary importance. What every creator should do, must do, is use the skills they have right now. A great masterpiece is within reach if only your willpower is strong enough, just like Green Lantern. Just look within yourself and say what you have to say. Cezanne and Jackson Pollock and many other great painters were horrible draughtsmen. It was only through sheer willpower to be great that they were great. The fire they had inside eclipsed their lack of technical skill. Although they started out shaky and even laughable, they went on to create staggering works of art. This letter is not for the established creators. They're hopeless. This letter is for the young bucks and does. Let's kick some fucking ass. From the Comics Journal, number 190, September 1996.
My first reaction to that when I read it was that it seems like a very emotionally motivated letter. It seems like he wrote it and then maybe didn't even go back to revise it, which is kind of keeping in line with the ethos that it's establishing.
So yeah, I just wanted to mention the fear of a royally screwed up marketplace is that's what I did want to talk about as the impetus that bore a lot of reality for a lot of people in comics is that this was right before there was a big bust. And I think a lot of very skilled independent comics artists sort of fell off in that point. Some of them didn't, and some of them kept putting out stuff, but a lot of people moved into other fields, often illustration. Okay, so Ellis is a visual artist, I guess they say these days, and he was better than other children when he was a children. But there's been like periods of time where he's done much more work and much less work. And I am the same way, so I've always continued to do some base level things, but there's been like a year or two playing guitar that I basically didn't really learn much. And you have eschewed traditional art instruction, and I think while I did it in public school, outside of public school, I haven't had a lot of musical instruction, and I'm suspicious of music theory. So I think we're actually pretty well disposed to have a decent perspective on this, because we are both, I think, reasonably outsider.
Oh, we went down the path less traveled.
Yeah. So I when I'd made music, I found that there were a lot of musicians that didn't really agree. I don't know, like didn't have. So that what I fell into is that people didn't like talking critically about art or music, and to me, they exist to be talked critically about and engaged and thought about and discussed about. And so I would often get turned off if that attitude was displayed. And so since that attitude was almost always displayed when I was talking to artists and musicians, I think the nice way to say it is it's a non-judgmental attitude. I think when that attitude was displayed, it made me sort of just have to do my own research and try to think about what I thought was really important myself. And part of that... Yeah, I mean, part of that's because you use what you have available to you or whatever, but so I guess what every creator must do is use the skills they have right now.
Yep. That seems strange because a lot of people don't have skills. If they tried to do something, it would be like very inconsistent. It is an approach that some people take, It seems to be a very popular approach now to just start making something and hope that you get better at doing the thing through continuously making it. But I don't see a lot of inspired work coming from that method.
So I found that especially in the last couple of years, there's been a great expansion of my ability as a songwriter and as a musician that is only a result of putting in the work. And that was a lot of that's just practicing and practicing and practicing. But it's also always trying to find art and music and film and writers and stuff. Try to find the people that you think are the best and try to refine your tastes and not be afraid of judging dead people or living people, because you're not hurting them. And if they're artists, if they're pretty much any public figure, I mean, they can deal with a little bit of scrutiny as to the stuff they publish. I find a lot of the sensitivity, I think, is on behalf of the artists, but not from the artists, which is common in our society.
I think that people are afraid of making people more hesitant to like do creative work. Like they don't want to discourage them from doing the thing that they want to be doing. But I think that's because like we're less concerned with helping people become good at the thing that it is that they want to be doing and more concerned with just having people do things that make them happy or whatever. That like the idea of just being a painter is like good enough rather than like hoping that your friend becomes like the best painter that they can be.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is this sort of token effort to provide a space for artists or musicians, but without really knowing what makes those spaces work or what has in the past. And I think that we live in an area where there's a lot of extremely skilled fine artists, and that's because there is a developed market for fine art right now in the United States. It's a very good field to be in right now. I don't know if that'll be the case when the banks collapse, but right now it's probably better than it's ever been. It's easier to get exposure.
Well, I don't know. Did you say for fine art?
For fine artists, yeah.
You certainly can get exposure more easily, but I also think that the value of their work has been pushed down considerably.
Yeah, and I also do think fine art is kind of under commercial art right now. Fine art is just the sort of academy trained, like upper class. It's hard for many fine artists to escape like oodles of convention.
Yeah.
Because they need something to build on in order to make something that like excellent. Because hyperrealism is big right now. I'll show a couple of those. There's a guy up in Maine, Todd Bonita, and he has canvases for sale for $1,000 that are that big. And so like
that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And so they make their living teaching, which I like. I do kind of think that people should have a mixed approach, and most of the good artists and musicians I know, all of the good artists and musicians I know are passionate about teaching younger people. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's with that part of the craft is the enemy. He talks about Cezanne and Jackson Pollock. We'll talk a little bit more about Cezanne because it's mentioned in the next letter. But Jackson Pollock,
like very specifically a guy who spent a lot of time working on his process, like really nailed down like the physical apparatuses that he needed to make the work that he wanted, and like figured out the techniques and trajectories that it would take to get the output that he wanted. It just seemed very, very strange to pick him.
I think Jackson Pollock is not an artist. I think he's just craft. I think
he's
100%
like 100% craft.
I hate his work.
I don't hate it. It's pretty mundane if you aren't seeing it yourself. It does have like an effect to see it in person, even not really being particularly familiar with how important the work is supposed to be. The first time I saw Jackson Pollock, I did think that it was pretty neat, but it's pretty neat in the same way that like a spirograph is. If you don't know what a spirograph is, Gibson will post a picture of a spirograph.
Yeah, it's fine. We're not taking notes. I'm sure I'll get all these in. So this is the next letter. It's from Jeff Levine. Jeff Levine is a cartoonist. This is a panel from No Hope, which came out in 96, so about the time this was written. And you'll see that the letters kind of take a little ad hominem tone for the rest of the exchange, as is to be expected.
Yeah, they get a little spicy.
A little bit spicy. I'm surprised to see you printed James Kochalka's near moronic letter in the latest Comics Journal number 189 regarding craft being the enemy. I might agree that trying to draw well is not of primary importance, but at the same time I think it is, in fact, incredibly important. What makes comics a unique medium is the combination of words and pictures, and while a naive artist or writer's work can occasionally be amusing, to advise that technical skill is to be avoided is a ridiculous philosophy. If you take Kochalka's statement that both Cezanne and Jackson Pollock, and many other great painters, were horrible draftsmen as being true, and that despite that they still made great art, it's horribly bad logic to imply that that means that technical skill isn't worth acquiring or working hard to achieve. I can think of a lot more artists who were great draftsmen, who made timeless, worthwhile art, than artists who didn't have those skills, whose work is worth studying and admiring. Yes, art doesn't always have to be technically strong to be good, but it certainly tends to help. The last thing modern comics is in need of are more naive artists lacking technical skills. When the majority of comics that are currently being published... That was the camera clicking, which caused my dog to bark. Because he's insane. Come on! Come on, Jeffrey! Come on! Come on! Comment! The last thing modern comics is in need of are more naive artists lacking technical skills, when the majority of comics that are currently being published are so horribly drawn that there's little to be gained by looking at them. I'd be much more interested in a new artist's work that was original and well drawn, that actually had something interesting to say, than looking at a bunch of felt tip pen, poorly drawn comics about elves and robots. This letter is for all the young bucks and does. Learn to write. Learn to draw. Having a professionally published comic is a privilege, not a right, and it has to be earned. Let's kick some fucking ass.
Yep.
So, the website that I linked to shows Pyramid of Skulls by Paul Cezanne, but I mostly just wanted to talk about Paul Cezanne in particular because he's not Jackson Pollock. So Cezanne was a more traditional artist.
Yeah.
All of his art is representative?
Everything that I've seen is representative.
Which is to say...
It's abstract to one extent or another.
Painterly, but it's representations of people, objects, like regular day.
Lots of fruit.
Regular day. Lots of fruit, yeah. So, they
Lots
show...
of fruit and men playing cards.
Yeah. Oh, I'll make sure to put up the Beaker one.
Oh, yeah, that one's a good one.
It's Beaker. And they show Pyramid of Skulls. And what stuck out to me about Pyramid of Skulls is it's not particularly well done. I've seen a lot of skulls. I've seen a lot of paintings. I've seen a lot of watercolors. Nothing about it is exceptional. And I know that there's a lot of artists that get elevated beyond their work, what their work merits, because they were seen as important traditionally by people in universities usually, or the people that are setting opinions. But I think that...
Or because their work sells
yeah,
for more money than other artists' work for one reason or another, or maybe it's just more regularly on the market, so they get more exposure. Like that kind of stuff can actually have a big impact on like an artist's popularity and then historical importance later on down the line.
Yeah, so I'm just going to I'm going to show a Cezanne, and then I'm going to find another picture around the same time, probably like pre-Raphaelite, just because, like, off the top of my head, I know that's a bunch of good painters, but I'll show you a Russian realist around the turn of the century, which was in Paul Cézanne painted Pyramid of Skulls. Ilya Repin, I believe his name is. And so I would just argue that these aren't that exceptional. You can find a lot of realists. Well, I mean, they're good, but you can find a lot of people painting around the same time that did very, very good work. And it's not clear to me that Cézanne should be seen as exceptional in any way.
And I think that the most relevant thing to point out here is that while he can make decent paintings, you could actually think that the technical ability of the paintings that he's making is very high, which it isn't. It's like middling for the age, but more importantly, it is. There is almost no like inspiration in his work. It is all very mundane. He was not painting any new subjects. He was not painting things that other people weren't painting. He wasn't really like pushing the boundaries of the style that he was painting in very far. He wasn't doing anything new really,
and he wasn't working in something like hot, new, that like lots of people could see, like Winsor McCay right now. Bam.
Yeah, he was using the same materials that people before him used, painting pretty much the same things in more or less the same way, like with a lower level of detail and a slightly higher level of abstraction than the more traditional artists of the time.
Yeah, so I think that these guys probably respect Cézanne more than that, or have a higher estimation. But I actually think it's kind of I think that artists of that time period were more inundated with the idea of these inherited artistic authorities, whereas we had the internet. And you can just rip it on the internet. You can just see so much crazy art that it breaks down so quickly your idea that the famous people you've heard of are the best people, because Raphael's crap, and there's so much good stuff before and after the Dutch old masters and stuff. Here's the one with the skull I found. Here's Cézanne's skulls. The Dutch master was in the 17th century. And so it's just, there's so much good painting that most people don't hear about. As soon as you start to find that on the internet, and you also see contemporary artists, you realize that what you've been seeing has nothing to do with what is good.
Yep.
It's very, very small correlation. Statistically insignificant correlation.
A really good example of this, I think, is the massive popularity of Starry Night, which is not even a finished painting and not a good painting by like a crazy dude who did much better work than that people aren't familiar with as popular art. It's just, I mean, it has very little to do with the quality of the work. Like the popularity of that painting. It boggles my mind.
I like his little dig at ElfQuest towards the end.
Yes. That is really important, I think, it's something that isn't explored super thoroughly in these letters either. Like, it's brought up a couple times, but it almost feels like it should be like the primary thing that's being explored, that the ElfQuest comics and all of the work that I've seen by this guy are really uninspired.
It's a couple. It's Wendy and Paul Dini. That's who makes ElfQuest.
Oh, okay.
When they started reprinting that stuff, I hadn't really seen it except when I was really young. It is very bad. There's some stuff about it that's better than the norm today, because people today, comic artists in particular, are operating at an even lower level of ability. So in comparison, it looks better than, say, the Cal Arts grads or the people working on, like, most of the people working on Adventure Time comics, stuff like that, are operating at, like, the level of a 13-year-old with access to MS Paint, and they graduated the art school that Walt Disney founded to try to make generations of excellent artists. See how that went. But yeah, I just think that there's this proliferation because of what comics have become, because there's not a lot of it's a really weird industry. I think that there's a lot of people that are direct paid on the internet. They have patronage, they have direct patronage, and those people are good. A lot of those people are good, or at least they're doing a thing that they keep getting better at. And I've followed a lot of webcomics. But then there's these people that work in the comics industry that are from art schools, or they work for the New Yorker, or like it's just this prestige game, and it's just a bunch of really uninspired crap, and it's a lot like what you'll see if you try to read every article in Slate magazine or something, or you try to read every article in New Yorker magazine. You're just going to get a bunch of like pretentious, half thought out, non-rendered crap, which is what a lot of comics are. Marvel and DC are like very well, like art, the art direction is often very well controlled and contained. And so they've kept that up. They've kept up a way of making comics that not a lot of other companies do. But
it's gotten much more congealed in that way recently. I think that there was a period of time during that boom that you were referring to in the 90s where there was more deviation in the art styles in Marvel Comics. Less so in DC Comics, if I'm accurate in remembering here. But there was a lot of deviation in some of the popular Marvel comics. But now, and more recently, there's like 2 or 3 predominant styles that seem to exist.
So DC and Marvel will use outsider styles if it's a recognized artist, or if it's safe, if it's like chibi or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And this seems mostly like a marketing decision.
Genre painting. So if you think I'm a big jerk face, and I don't know what I'm talking about with comics, the market hasn't really grown as the population's grown. It's only shrunk. And so comics have just shrunk in direct influence and in circulation. And in my opinion, the traditional industry was slowly dying pre-corona. And now there are great disruptions in distribution that could stop DC from publishing comics. Right now, DC doesn't have adequate distribution for their comics. So the industry has been teetering on the verge of collapse, and it's been engaging in these race to the bottom, like making 50 variant versions of a number one, sort of catering
That's gotten so crazy.
Yeah, just like it was in the 90s. And it's catering not to people to read it. They're not trying to write good stories for people to read and get engaged with. They are trying to sell stuff to be resold on eBay or to be bought for speculatory purposes.
It's like hype beasts.
It's just like hype beasts, yeah. It's just that hype. And which is different from Magic, because at least until recently, the value of Magic cards was generally based on their value
their usability.
Yeah. Yeah. So so we've got our James Kochalka. We've got and then Jeff Levine's the guy that responded to him. So James Kochalka is saying that you want to get to work right away. You don't want to develop your craft. And Jeff Levine's saying, lol, learn to draw. And this is building the tone where they're getting less.
Do you want me to read the next one?
Do you want to?
I can. Yeah.
Do you think you can?
I'm ready to challenge James Kochalka. To channel James Kochalka. So this one is titled Craft Isn't a Friend. James Kochalka from Burlington, Vermont. Okay. I'll say it again in a different way for the idiots who couldn't understand me the first time. When you're shooting for immortality, anything less than stunning achievement is a failure. Creating a powerful work of art is like running and leaping across a chasm. It takes all of your strength, and you'll probably be dashed on the rocks and fall to your death. Being a craftsman is like sitting in your woodshop all day carefully building a chair, and when you're done, you sit on it. Are comics craft? Well, certainly any cartoonist you're liable to meet will tell you yes, and that's a big problem. Craft is boring. Ever been to a crafts fair? Not unlike a comics convention. Craft sucks. When a cartoonist sits down to draw, and their goal is to draw well, they are doomed to failure. No matter how much they practice, the best they can hope for is to become a polished hack, aping their preconceived ideas of good comics, to become a mere hollow shell of the cartoonists who came before. For one reason, there's no objective good in art. Someone could conceivably think Spawn is well drawn and think Peanuts is poorly drawn, although that sounds insane to me. So if you're trying to draw well, what you're shooting for is illusory. There is, objectively, no such thing. However, if you're burning up inside with the need to express yourself, if there's something you desperately need to say, when you sit down at the drawing table, you think, how am I going to say this? How am I going to express myself so that people will understand? The art will be a slave to the content. Either the artist expresses the meaning, emotion, and power of their vision, or they do not. The comic succeeds or fails on these terms. The notion of quality is meaningless. And this was from the Comics Journal, number 192, in December of 1996.
So first things first, we can agree that Spawn has better art than Peanuts?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree to that. Peanuts, the art in Peanuts is good in that it communicates the things that it intends to communicate and almost nothing else.
It's very safe and it doesn't change for decades.
There are basically a number of symbols that are repeated throughout the Peanuts strips that are highly recognizable, and the things that are included in the frame are all relevant to the narrative of the work. And so if that's what you're maximizing for with art, then it does that very well.
Like efficiency per line. Yeah, so Spawn is like not in some ways it is a masterwork because it's we're now in 2020. It's been a continuous comic in a period where almost no comics remained continuous, including Marvel and DC comics. It's been continuously numbered is what I mean, and Todd McFarlane has worked on the bulk of it. Todd McFarlane floated Image Comics with his action figures, and then Image Comics came back, and a few years ago, sort of reinvigorated the independent market, which a lot of other companies have been able to latch themselves onto. And so Image, in this period, put out titles like East of West, and Saga, and Paper Girls, and We Stand on Guard, a lot of other really broadly selling comics that reach people that comics normally never reach. Basically, just your ideal situation for market expansion. And that happened because Todd McFarlane sold Spawn because he ripped it. He told his like half-baked like hell superhero. It's very Spawn is a lot of what popular entertainment just turned into. Everything's about demons and Satan and explosion and murder.
It was either prescient or very influential. It was like was kind of like the edgy comic books, kind of like the edgy manga and like animation that was being produced, toned down a little bit and then brought into like a dystopian like gang war futuristic setting that was very relatable to people at the time. I mean, I think that the themes in Spawn were like very like much just kind of repurposed general themes from other stuff that was popular, but put inside of a framework that was very relatable to young people growing up in the United States. Like, people were actually afraid that the country was going to turn into the setting from Spawn.
And a lot of children who are outgrowing traditionalist Christianity. And I mean, Spawn takes this Christian mythos and it turns it into a comic book. And so I think that part of the process of the secularization of like huge parts of the country are pieces of art like Spawn. I mean, I think Spawn is a bridge towards it spoke to a lot of people in a way that nothing has spoken to them since. We have had multiple customers who like Spawn more than anything else. And he put it out continuously. Todd McFarlane's done some shady stuff, but it's just like Spawn wasn't a particularly good example, I think, for that. So I think one of his main things, besides saying craft fairs are boring... What the fuck you talking about, James Kochalka? You live in Vermont.
That is pretty crazy.
What a crazy asshole!
Like, the quilting and stuff that you see coming out of Vermont is pretty insane. If you can't appreciate that, then there is probably something wrong with your head.
If you can't entertain yourself in a room with 30 old ladies, like, you're actually a demented person. Like, there's something wrong with you. Old ladies are the best people to talk to because they just give you the straight shit. And they just tell you what they're thinking, and they tell you the things they like, and it's not wrapped up in this pretension and wanting people to think you're a superstar, and it's just awesome. I love craft fairs, so he's wrong about that. This art craft division to me, this thing seems like an academic discussion in a realm that should defy academia. I basically think if you want to know about art, get good.
I think that the use of the word craft in here is probably wrong, and he probably would have just been better off using the word skill.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Excellent. Yeah. So that there's no objective good in art. A lot of people might agree with this off of the bat, but if you think about it, you're not going to say that... I'm going to compose a piece, and you can put it up against Piano Sonata number 14 in C sharp minor, Moonlight Sonata. So it's up for you to decide whether or not that piece that I put only that much time into. So my entire, the length of the piece is exactly the period of time I put into it, as opposed to one of Beethoven's pieces that he wrote over weeks or months, refined. So it's sort of absurd. It's very absurd. I mean, it's one of the primary things that has always bothered me is that we publicly revere people who dedicated their lives to building skills, but then we say that the skills don't matter. But it's selective. You're not going to hire a roofer who's never made a good roof. But you might hire a crappy artist because your life doesn't depend on it. All your stuff's not going to get ruined if someone paints a crappy painting. And I think that the reason that people adopt this is because they don't want to seem judgmental, which, like I said, is the prevailing attitude, especially in people who like music and art, because I think a lot of these people did get like harshly and unfairly judged by people in positions of authority when they were young, especially in things like art and music class in school. I think a lot of people didn't have great experience with that. I think actually music less than art. I think art...
No, go ahead.
Art classes just exist to make people hate art. That's high school art.
I think that another reason that people might think that art is as objective as they tend to think it is would be that you're frequently only thinking of the effect that art has on you. You're not thinking about all of the effects that art has. If you talk to other people about the things that they personally appreciate and the things that they personally get out of art, then you can understand all of the things that can make art good. But generally, the things that are very appealing about art to you are going to be fairly narrow in the scope of things that art can do for people in general. And so it is probably better to think about the value of art for everybody when you're trying to evaluate whether one piece of art is better than another.
I do also think that if people would agree on the aspects of art that they like. Broadly, people fall into a few camps, and they'll tell you about, people will put the value in the expression, they'll put the value in the realism, which I would call truth to reality. So I think that what good art is, what good writing is it's all something that displays a correlation with reality. It is more true.
I think that I frequently see people who value opposite properties in art, which kind of makes it a little bit more difficult, because you have to, I guess, try to assume why they're valuing opposite properties. Like, a lot of people will like art simply because it defies convention, not necessarily because of the other properties of the piece. Like the fact that it is somehow going against conventions is considered to be value in itself by a lot of people.
Right, and that's a wonderful illusion, and this is something I hoped we would remember to talk about, is the convention is this crap. The white canvases, the bad art. James Kochalka was the mouthpiece of the modern commercial art movement, which has dominated all other forms of art. It is conventional to try to be unconventional.
That is the meme. It's like a low skill barrier, so more people feel like they can do it.
The less effort and skill you put into it, the better. So ideally, you go to college, you spend $100,000 at an art school for 4 years, and then you just arrange trash and put it in a museum or something. So your work is completely dependent on a museum. You're not working in the digital mediums that would force you to compete with poor and working people, basically. They would force you to actually put yourself into a marketplace and say, oh, people don't like your webcomic, or oh, people don't like your illustrations on DeviantArt. Because there are people who have succeeded without completely subverting themselves to the market online. There's a lot of those artists. And so I think these people coming out of school have to convince themselves that they're different, or that they're going to take a different route or something. But I mean, I don't envy them, because they're going to find out they're wrong. I mean, if you look at just all the shakeups that are going on in like journalism and stuff, I would expect the same stuff to go on for professionally employed artists, as the market has to adjust to the differences that have been inflicted in our lives. That's going to change the art people need, and I don't think that the current structures are flexible enough to account for it. So I think that we're going to continue to see this great opening up. Discovery Channel, History Channel, those have already been supplanted by YouTube. I mean, unless you're talking about ancient alien shows, in which case, oh wait, they were supplanted by YouTube 20 years ago, before YouTube even existed.
Well, you can still talk about German National Socialists on the History Channel, but not necessarily on YouTube anymore.
That's true. So, yeah, and also this, if you're burning up inside with the need to express yourself, I think that it shouldn't necessarily be taken for granted that what your need is to express yourself. It might actually to be heard. And so there might be ways that you can be heard that don't involve publishing unfinished work. So, I guess before we move on, we're going to go to Jim Woodring. And this is a great place. I will put, with a big fair use stamp on it, I'm going to put up some James Kochalka. So this is what he was working on at the time. It's called American Elf, and I think he did one every day. And then this is one of his more recent color works. I didn't want to say this up front because I didn't want to prime people either way, but I do think that before we get into the rest of this, I really don't have any respect for James Kochalka as an artist. He's also a musician. His music is very bad.
His music is very bad, and like kind of particularly bad.
Yeah, so the thing that's interesting about music is he does a lot of the things that I think underpracticed and underdeveloped songwriters do, or comedians do, which is that he over relies on references. Instead of developing his own ideas, putting out his own stuff, having the confidence to do anything that's not sort of like ironic or a joke. Like presumably anyone watching this podcast has like listened to my music, and so they know that I write songs with a sense of humor, but you can do all of it, and so you're limiting yourself if you just consider yourself one thing. And he doesn't have room to expand because he never built up the skills. And so, by contrast, Jim Woodring is my favorite living artist. I mean, I found out about his art from this letter exchange. And I just absolutely think that his art is of the highest caliber, and there's a very short list of people I think are comparable. Charles Burns comes to mind. But I even think that Jim Woodring's art, it's just so good.
It is very good.
I'm just going to put some up on the screen, and if the video gets pulled, I don't think that there will be any issue with it. But it's just so good. There's a lot of stuff that he already has publicly available. So here's Jim Woodring's reply. One idiot's reply. Jim Woodring, Seattle, Washington. As one of the idiots who disagreed with James Kochalka's first anti-craft letter, I want to reply to his brazen follow-up. Kochalka, you are wrong. Craft is control. It is the ability to create according to one's intentions, not in spite of one's limitations. Imagine saying that a writer doesn't need to know how to write, or that an architect need not be concerned with craft. Well, I can imagine you saying it. Was your point that craft without content is not great art? Well, no shit. Everyone knows that. Craft fair's not your cup of tea? Tut tut. To describe Pollock and de Kooning as artists who were great despite a lack of craft is absurd. They may not have been great draftsmen, but they both had oodles of craft as painters, which is after all what they're known for. Both men were obsessed with getting exactly the effects they wanted, and they worked like demons to develop their particular crafts. You say there is no such thing as good drawing. Wish it into the cornfield, Jimmy. I've got an idea. Why don't you redraw the pictures of Heinrich Clay, preserving only the ideas? We'll see what role craft plays then. So we'll show a little bit of Heinrich Clay, because I think that that's relevant. And as soon as I found the images of the elephants and the alligators, I knew immediately what he was saying. Basically, it's very difficult to describe the composition. And then he talks about Willem de Kooning. Don't know this guy. Do you know who this guy is?
I don't think so.
It's another one of those abstract pieces. It looks horrible. So I guess if he's comparable to Pollock, but to me it just looks terrible. And I suppose you can decide. So I basically agree with this. No one is saying that even commercial artists will phrase that their drawings are trying to tell you a story or give you a slice of life or give you an expression of something. And so it's like no one is making the claim that you don't need to do both. Even the artist manuals that I've read from the 30s, like by, I think Loomis is his name, Andrew Loomis, he talks about how you have to have an idea about what's going on in the scene and what the people are, how they're interacting.
That is part of the craft.
That's part
is making new content.
Think about a commercial. You know, when you see all the people in the commercial, you already know about their life just from seeing these pre-established stereotypes, basically. Like these artistic conventions, they let you know as soon as you see this group of people that it's a family. They just got their new car. The dad is wacky and incompetent. Like it
he may have side effects, including rectal bleeding.
Yeah, and so it's even commercial artists, the most commercial artists, try to build a narrative into their work. Think about in advertisement where a beautiful woman is used and she's even just looking at something in a particular way. It's trying to send a signal. It's trying to tell a small bit of a story.
Advertisements do also find new, like, novel and interesting ways to use sex to sell non-sexual products very frequently too. Even the most commercial art, innovation is highly valuable, and it's just like very important to the most rote type of creative work that you could possibly think of.
Yeah.
So you don't just, if you just make the same advertisement that somebody made for their product, it's just not going to work for you. It's just going to reinforce people's ability to identify with the previous product. That happens very frequently with comic books too. Like, you'll see a comic book that is illustrated in a way that it could have been illustrated by somebody else, and it's just not going to help you recognize the new artist. Or the new writer, or whatever sort of thing it is that's being kind of like strictly copied. I guess that's why art movements are named after the people that start them.
It's much easier to learn a song rather than just to write a song. Is one way of looking at it. Is that it takes a different level of skill to learn a song than to write one with even the same amount of chords, the same amount of lyrics and stuff. So there is a substantial James Kochalka. I think he probably knew Jim Woodring's work, because Jim Woodring was an underground cartoonist, and also he was around in the area sometimes. I think Kochalka...
Yes, it seems like most of the... It seems like we were the last people to find out about Jim Woodring, basically.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I had a lot of customers that never heard of his work.
Right. Yeah, I'm talking about in this community of people, I guess.
So I mean, if Jim Woodring called me out and I drew like James Kochalka, I would be upset too. But we really wanted to make sure to cover the artists they're talking about, because we don't even like. I didn't really know who Cezanne was even before I read this, when I first read it a few years ago and stuff like that. And so there's going to be a bit of that in the next letter, but we're going to take a short break, and then we have the James Kochalka and then a couple shorter replies. The last letter we're reading, it's not the last letter in the exchange. It's by Scott McCloud, who's a very respected comic artist he did Ghost World, which was turned into a movie, and he wrote something called Understanding Comics, which lots of people like to read before making comics. His stuff doesn't do it for me, but yeah, so pretty much all the major respondents are people working in the field. So we're going to break and come back. We suddenly returned.
Hi.
So this is the last James Kochalka. Do you want to read this, James Kochalka?
Sure.
Okay. This one's very long. Yep, like I said, I will be putting this text up as we read it, but I'd really encourage you to go back and read the exchange by yourself, because it is cool beans. And there's more to it that we omitted.
Folly. James Kochalka. It may be folly to keep writing back, but oh well. I don't feel too much real need to respond to Jim Woodring's answer to my letter specifically, but it does give me a good starting point to continue and expand on my rant. I don't think Woodring read very carefully, because I never even mentioned de Kooning in my letter, let alone set him as an example of someone being great despite lacking craft. De Kooning is a craftsman through and through, and a marvelous one at that. However, his very best painting, The First Woman, has nothing to do with craft. It was a violent attack, an error. In fact, he rejected it and threw it away. Luckily, a friend found and rescued it. And it's got so much more life than his many countless well-crafted works, which get a little boring, actually. Craft allows you to be pretty good most of the time, which is absolutely useless. The only thing that allows you to be great is taking massive risks. Craft is knowledge. You perfect your craft, slowly adding to what you know how to do. But great art only comes from risking to attempt what you do not know. No matter how much craft you have under your belt, it will not help break the magic barrier to creating a truly great and immortal work of art. Only a complete abandonment of your mental safeguards will allow you to do that. Craft will hinder you, keep you forever tied to the world of the known. So while craft may give you tools to express yourself reasonably well, it's just not enough. I'm not talking about craft without content. I'm saying that craft is not enough to express content in a way that will have any real effect on anyone. For instance, who could better express anger? A professional session musician who is a technical expert, or the punk rock kid who can barely put two chords together? My money's on the punk. But beyond even that, to get to a real heart and soul of what makes us human, it takes a wild leap away from the safety of our conventions, our craft. Craft is a rope tying us to mediocrity of expression. We're all too timid to untie it. But we've worked so hard to learn to draw, how to write, we can't give that up. If we untie the rope, we'll just float off into space, we whine. I'd rather fucking choke and die in the vacuum of space than anemically craft a series of smarty pants sequential pictures and pat myself on the back for my skillful accomplishment. A joy of comics is their stupidity, their simplicity. That way they can cut right to your soul so easily. Just a simple string of symbols and pictures. How can they do that? Magic! It's magic. Pure and simple, not craft. I refuse to accept that the magic of comics is crafted. It comes out of nowhere. I know it. Yet at the same time, clearly the opposite is true. Comics is a visual medium, and all there is to see is ink on the page. What we see is processed by the brain and in turn creates an electrochemical emotional response inside of our bodies. The composition within panels, the transition between them, every minute touch of the brush will affect the meaning of the comic and the reader's response. Can the artists really control all of this well enough to produce the response in the reader that they intend? Especially considering that each reader's response will be tempered by their own lifetime of experience. Can anyone possibly predict any of this reasonably well enough to craft a comic that will actually function as they desire it to? And that's assuming that the universe is truly governed by laws of cause and effect. What if things occur randomly? You don't want to be thinking about any of this crap when you sit down to draw, I'm pretty sure. Better let it flow out like magic, or lash out wildly like a beast, than to try second-guessing the universe well enough to actually craft greatness. I'm sure that you'll have little trouble learning how to craft mediocrity, however. I don't even really know where to start. It sounds, at certain points in this, like he's directly criticizing his own work, where he says, I'd rather fucking choke and die in the vacuum of space than anemically craft a series of smarty pants sequential pictures and pat myself on the back for my skillful accomplishment. That is a very succinct explanation of what he is doing.
American Elf in particular, I think the whole claim to fame is that it just updated every day for like 10 years or something. But it's utter crap.
And it all looks the same.
Yeah, and it all looks the same. He like very rarely breaks format. His newer stuff where he does break format, it's just to like insert digitally art elements that don't usually make a ton of sense. One of his books is called
Super Fuckers.
One of his books is called one of them just has fuck in the name. I forget. One of his more major ones, and like, it's just like ultra small format, flat washes, like in MS Paint. His more recent stuff, he takes out the border digitally, so it has like a construction paper look. Johnny Boo is one of his major series. Oh, it's a friendly ghost, and it's just like, it's particularly mean-spirited. Like, there's plenty of good examples of that if you look through his stuff. And it's just, I mean, so he
talks about magic a lot, and I'm always wary of anything that talks about doing things by magic. That seems to be a couple things. One of them is a marketing term.
It's a con man play.
And the other thing is like the meme that magic is just sufficiently advanced technology to the point where we can't understand it. There are lots of artists who understand the technology of using positive and negative space and like shade and perspective to provoke emotional responses out of people. And if you think that a lot of these people are doing it unintentionally, that they just happen to be able to create something that is like great art, a lot of the times you just don't understand the technology, the mental technology, the skill that they're using to create these effects. Like, it's possible that he can't actually think about art as he's making it, or he isn't making art to a sufficient extent where he understands the intentional work that goes into making compositions.
Yeah, so I have seen like him do some watercolor, and he has a very basic level of skill that would indicate that he probably learned to do stuff in art school and then stopped. I understand these impulses. You could get away with this. You can get away with this if you don't like need to compete in a hyper-competitive market, and you can just get your stuff marketed because you know the right people, which is really the impression I get with James Kochalka, because he went to the most expensive state school in the country. I was wrong about the colleges. He actually went to MICA, Maryland Institute College of Art, a private art school that costs about as much as New York University or Harvard. NYU is my go-to for expensive colleges. 1 year of MICA is about 50 grand. 1 year at NYU is about 50 grand. 1 year at Harvard is about 50 grand. And my podunk state school, $11,750 for a matriculated year. So it's a very high tier school, very expensive private art school, been around for hundreds of years. Oh yeah, and Micah's website says their meal plans are designed specifically to match the lifestyle of artists. So it's ramen and rock cut vodka, sketchy psychedelics. And he just like the bad music and the bad comic books and the fact that he keeps popping up, it just sort of reeks of old friends, or just like, oh, that's a name that existed before everything shifted to the internet, so therefore there's some sort of legitimacy. Jeff Levine was the first person to write. We read his letter earlier, and we did look up his art in the break, and it is not amazing. It is better than James Kochalka, especially at the time. So I'll just put one up. I'll put them up side by side, and you can see in Jeff Levine's work, there's more perspective. The character's more proportioned. There's more expression to the face, and there's still serious flaws in Jeff Levine's work, I think.
Yeah, I wouldn't actively search out either one of them as an artist to enjoy, but it is more clear, even just from looking at the art, that Jeff Levine has something to say.
Yep.
The compositions are more complex. They show more emotion.
Yeah, so the Kochalka stuff has this sort of ironic detachment, which is characteristic of art made in the time period, which I think is just because he's... I mean, there's a lot of things you have to work past as an artist when you're expressing yourself, and it's much easier to be sarcastic and sardonic and always say something that's referential or postmodern or like relativistic or whatever. Just sort of say like something that seems quippy, and that passes as clever for the small amount of people that you're peddling your stuff to. But like we said in the beginning, comics it's a very undersized industry compared to the size of the country. A lot of really well-selling comics sell 100,000 issues, and there's like 330 million people in the United States. And in the 70s and 80s, a lot of those comics were selling 1 million issues. So I don't know. There's so many webcam artists. There's so many webcomic artists that before during and after James Kochalka, he would have been right at the beginning of the webcams, and there's like that Neo Tokyo one that's been running forever, or Mega Tokyo. There's a lot of web. Do I keep saying webcams?
Yes.
I'm waiting on a webcam. It's
you
taken
can't tell.
2 weeks. 2 weeks. Anyway, so there's a lot of webcomics made sense and made at basically at the same time that are just better done than James Kochalka. We read one called Elf Tour, which has a higher quality of art. I'll try to find some.
Which is crazy. I mean, I don't know if you can even still find Elf Tour.
Oh, yeah, it's rare.
But, man, another example of one that has a higher quality of art would be like White Ninja Comics. Which I think that I don't know if those are still being made, but just thinking back, like it's a fairly low effort comic, but it is a higher level of quality.
What's that one called where people they talk a lot? Subnormality? Is that what it's called? I think that's what it's called. There's Gone with the Blast Wave was one I read when it was coming out.
That one had particularly good art for a webcomic at the time.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that made it stand out.
One thing about webcomics is you have this eternal scrolling format, which actually works really kind of well with comic books.
It can. People still manage to fuck it up with the webcomics.
Yeah.
Somehow.
But the person, if I got the name right, I think it's Subnormality. They're one of the first people I found that had these. They're actually like impossible to read without a desktop, some of them, because they're so huge and they just go down and go down and go down. And they would make new comics of different lengths, basically. An issue would come, or, usually a web comic was just one frame. But this person, the frame would just be very, very long. XKCD is a popular webcomic artist.
I was just thinking about that. I'm not sure if you would say that. I think that probably that is lower effort.
No, because XKCD stuff is like infographic. A lot of it actually does have.
There's a lot of thought put into the actual composition.
There's very little evidence. There's thought put into James Kochalka's work.
That's true.
If there is, it is well hidden. And XKCD, very approachable to people. It's
very easy to read.
Yeah, it's not about it's like zero punctuation or something. It's not really about the complexity of the figures because it's so text based, and specifically it's like graph and infographic based. So there's an example of where you don't have to develop your craft if you make up for it in writing. Your craft as a artist, make up for it in writing. But James Kochalka just thought it was wiser to do neither. And the guy can, the guy can take it. He was successful. He made money. He sold a bunch of comic books.
There could be some writing that is better than the stuff that I absorbed. I certainly haven't looked at all of his output, but I found it very, very boring and mundane, and I don't know if I would be able to find the best examples of his writing because I would have to go through so much, just a giant bag of mids.
Yep. The punk rock thing, the better punk rock artists were better musicians.
I do like that. Mythical punk rock kid that gets evoked.
Dude, they're always talking about the Ramones, and just put Rock and Roll High School up next to Holiday in Cambodia.
And also just, I mean, a lot of that early punk rock was just a small deviation away from another genre of music, like surf rock.
Oh, yeah.
Ramones
is just poorly played rock and roll.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's another one of the traps that I think that people fell into, particularly in this time period, is they bought into genres a lot more than you should. The great difference that an alien would see between the Rolling Stones and a punk rock artist, like the Ramones, or maybe the Specials, who are considered ska. Yeah, and then another ska group.
like the specials with the boss tones or something.
Yeah.
People make a really huge distinction between the two if you're talking to people who like ska
people. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's night and day for them. Those are like two different genres entirely.
One of the issues with genres is they often react to each other sequentially, so the new one will be a reaction to the old one, and so oftentimes 20 years in a genre gets you sort of opposed ideas or philosophies, especially if it's active or if things are moving quickly in the society.
Yeah, I can't think of an example of genreification more extreme than heavy metal. There are like at least 100, probably several hundred subgenres of heavy metal music.
Yep. They try to do it. I think part of it's just because heavy metal is one of the only developed music markets remaining. Everything else is.
Well, there are a lot of genres inside of heavy metal that are very concerned with like technical complexity.
Yeah.
Which is not something that you see in almost any other genre of contemporary music.
Yep.
I am having trouble thinking of one.
Bluegrass is hyper-focused on musicianship, and I think it often falls into the same issues where it's more polished than it is interesting. And a lot of times they fall back on things that they know worked previously, which is what heavy metal does with classical or romantic music.
Sort of. I mean, there are a batch of genres inside of heavy metal that are like just trying to explore music theory, basically, not necessarily trying like making classical music with distortion, which is what a lot of it does, but actually just trying to make music that is hard to play for the small group of people that fetishizes that inside of metal, which is enough to support a handful of bands, like probably a bunch of them.
Yeah, I don't think that metal does it adequately, especially right now, but there is an aspect of storytelling in metal that has been important. And I think that metal is the type of music or the scene or whatever, or the industry that I think is closest to where we should be going. There's established metrics of excellence. There's enough very talented people like the guys in Iron Maiden that did a lot of work early on. Which allowed it to differentiate itself and sort of build its own identity, so it just didn't get completely melted into everything else.
Yeah, it's more of a popular genre now than it ever was, but it's never been and probably won't ever be the mainstream. Like the primary type of pop music.
Yeah,
maybe on purpose. Maybe it's by design. I guess like nu metal was very close to doing that. Death metal and like black metal intentionally, like these people intentionally make themselves sound like demons so that it won't become the most popular type of music. I think.
I mean, I honestly, I think that like people would be blown away if metal artists played their stuff a little more straight and didn't do screaming demon voices and turn down the distortion.
But like when they do that, it does tend to become like more popular music. I think like Lordi won one of those Eurovision contests a handful of years back. Like a lot of, but then it becomes rock music. Basically, it just becomes the next version of rock music at that point. So I maybe there's just something inside of the genre definition there that prevents it from being the monoculture.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing I want to talk about is the joy of comics is their stupidity, their simplicity, the way they can cut right to your soul so easily. Just a simple string of symbols and pictures. How do they do that? Magic. It's magic, pure and simple, not craft. So this is a guy who went to an academy and his professors crushed his intellectual identity, and he never learned to grow a spine and express himself by what he actually thought was true, and that's why his art is bad.
And this is what he just said is the opposite of what I think is good about comics.
The symbols thing is crazy. That is a total academic interpretation of like what a comic is, because what a comic is it's a piece of paper with ink soaked into it. I mean, you're putting this layer of symbology on it to make it seem mystical or divine, and I think it's because he doesn't have the respect for the medium.
And symbology is what you use when you don't want to do representative art. Like when you don't want to try to draw a person, you draw a person shape. And when you don't want to draw a flying bird, you draw a V in the sky.
Learning how to draw is breaking away from the symbology. Is that one of the main things about drawing on the right side of your brain, which is right side, left side?
It doesn't really matter because it's not like they're actually... It's not like the thought processes are on one side of your head or the other, but yeah, drawing on the right side of the brain.
It's like the most recommended art book.
Right.
And it's all about breaking from symbology. But yeah, I would really encourage Will Eisner, if you want to look at just sort of look at one person's output that was around for a long time. He marketed the first graphic novel, which was a deeply personal, beautifully illustrated story called Contract with God. Just an amazing artist.
And if you want to look at it, what comics can be when taken away from things like deadlines, I would really recommend the manga Berserk. It is very high quality. It's not the most intellectually complex thing that you could read, but the story is very good. It is somewhat complex. It deals with interesting psychological issues. It is certainly edgy, but it is massively influential on Japanese art, media, and popular culture because the guy who made it just didn't ever have to work under deadlines. He's just been able to publish it on his own schedule when he's done with it, and he can just spend insane amounts of time on small details inside of the panels and like really accurately draw what it is that he wants to draw. It is really, really good. I would also recommend reading Akira. It is long, and it was so good and next level when it came out that they made, I think, the most expensive animation ever made at that point.
But that came out in a serial format, so he was meeting his deadlines.
And he was meeting his deadlines, but it was still very technically good. Everything was drawn in perspective. There is more symbology used in that work, but it's like on a kind of like on a gradating scale. It's not like he was just using symbols to represent things, like a circle with a triangle cut out of it to represent a head. He was actually drawing human figures and like rendering three-dimensional space.
Yeah, so two people I wanted to mention is Winsor McKay again, another guy who worked on deadlines. You can see how he breaks symbology. Something will turn into something else. It'll morph. There's always this fluid moving action to his work. He was working on a tight deadline in an extreme constraint. And it was because he knew the color separation process so well that the Little Nemo stories that came out in color were printed as well as they were.
Yeah.
And then the other one is Fortunino. I don't remember his last name. Masadi maybe. But I will put that guy up. He was an Italian artist. I think he worked, it was in Italy or Buenos Aires. Anyway, he worked for a magazine, just worked at a very fast rate. As you'll see, it's really realistic, sort of, but it does have a symbolic element in that it shows complicated
arrangements
that mean things. And there's a story told by these compositions, like we were talking about earlier.
It's not realism, certainly. It is like romantic representations of scenes, like almost laid out like religious work. It's very good. It's very high detail.
Yeah. It actually, I think William Turner is a English painter. It's kind of a lot like painting in basically the period preceding. So Fortunino hated modern artists. He has an awesome quote about Picasso, and I think Cezanne too, just saying that these are fools that are damning generations of young artists, which I think absolutely happened. And I think that commercial art sort of glommed on to these easier forms like Picasso and stuff, things that don't have clear metrics to judge them by, because then you can just you can have less trained people. And if you're like a manager for talent, then that's better to have people who aren't confident in their own skills.
Do you want to break for a moment?
I don't actually know if that was Gina's car. One second.
You're going to want to move that mic about
fist away from my face.
Your face, Jeffrey.
Yeah, false alarm. Jeff, come on.
That was a good
all
lead.
Right. So, this is... I just left this one in. I don't know. This is by Duane Parton. I don't know if they're a comic professional. I don't think so. But this is sort of what I would think is kind of a representative view at the time. Because he mentions some more, I guess, authoritative comic people instead of mentioning art people. So Jim Woodring and James Kochalka were sort of dancing in the land of fine art the whole time. And not so much comic land. And this guy...
I think Jim Woodring is making something that is closer to fine art than most people who are making comics. So I think that it makes sense for him to bring it up. I think that what he's doing is like a tier above what anybody else even considers doing when making comics.
Yeah, I think that a lot of it's his more recent stuff. The Frank stories are textless. I think that Charles Byrne is really the only other living American artist I can think of that's sort of comparable. I do like Jim's stuff a bit better, but Charles Byrne, it's also just sort of undeniable masterwork. Also very weird. Lot of mutants. So this is Duane Parton in Houston, Texas. How pompous can James be? To assume that because someone disagrees with him, they don't understand his argument. It seems to me that his argument is simply not defensible. If Byrne Hogarth, Neil Adams, or John Byrne were to make the same argument, I might have some respect for their position. Why? Because they have skill, and are therefore able to select an appropriate style of art based on the ideas they are trying to communicate. I have never seen any work by Kochalka, the self-proclaimed superstar, to indicate that he has any significant talent. Therefore, his rant against craft sounds to me more like an excuse for his lack of ability than a truly defensible philosophical position. I simply find him and his work pathetic. He does call himself a superstar. He says, go out and be a star. This is like, there's this rock star idea that I think really confused people as to the end goal of any of this stuff. You're trying to get your ideas across, which you have to refine by thinking and reading and talking, and that's what a writing profession is. And comics are writing, you're storytelling. And with music, too, the point isn't to play in front of a bunch of screaming people in venues we now know can't exist. It's never been that. Music's always been about the community aspect of it. And the industry caused people to completely lose sight of that. To the point that I think we're in a much worse spot as far as people being able to appreciate and participate in making music now than we were 50 years ago, or even when this letter exchange was written. We just left Duane in. I left Duane in, I should say, because Neil Adams and John Byrne, I don't know Hogarth so much. I put all those people's art up when I read it, but Neil Adams and John Byrne are still Neil Adams especially, seen as like sort of authoritative figures in comics. And a lot of that is Neil Adams worked a lot and never really truly retired. And could put out work quickly. And I don't like Neil Adams as much as Jack Kirby, because I think Jack Kirby had to draw weird monster mutant men more, actually due to limitations. But I think Jack Kirby was maybe a little bit less skilled in the fundamentals than Neil Adams, but he had lots of ideas, which he clearly got by reading contemporary science fiction.
This is kind of off that strand, but it seems strange to me that we never really got any examples of like somebody jumping, like making a leap of faith and trying to make art that they didn't have, that the skill set for didn't exist. I can't really think of any examples of that ever happening and like good art coming out of it. And it would have been really nice if he had provided. Am I wrong? Did he ever like talk about a specific?
So from what I understand, even people we think are really influential or exceptional are all very clearly operating off of previous artists. Very heavily influenced by previous artistic or musical traditions.
Right. And even if you could say that they're not very heavily influenced by a previously existing artist, they are at least partially, and then they're also generally building on top of a format that they're trying to develop.
Inescapable with music.
Well, it's also inescapable with art. Just like the way that art happens it's from, like, even if you're trying to not think about it, it's still heavily reliant on muscle memory. Like, there are things that our body allows us to do, actions that we can take with our arms, and there are actions that we can't take with our arms, and so those are just going to dictate the types of shapes and the shapes of lines even that you're going to draw by default.
The instrument you play is going to change how you write songs.
Right.
Certain chords or whatever are more or less accessible.
Right, and so it just, the more I think about his argument, the more it just kind of dissolves into nothing. Like, there's nothing I can really, trying to reinforce his argument. I can't really think of a way to do it very well. Trying to steal man, I do think that there is a lot of value to like art, to comic strips, to comic books that are trying to do something new and maybe don't have like the best execution.
That type of periodical stuff he's doing, he could be doing both. There's no choice. I mean, there's no choice necessary because it's so quick to draw a cartoon like that.
Yeah. Well, so I guess like XKCD, that is a comic in which they basically were trying to do a different format, which is these infographics.
Yeah.
And it's really clear that there was no cliff that got jumped off of. No. It started off as a regular webcomic with stick figures talking to each other, and then it evolved gradually over time into the thing that it is, that is very different from other...
And very clearly transformational. Someone would point at that and say that's Bob Dylan. But Bob Dylan just wanted to be Elvis. So everyone's always had their goals in mind, and since they're different people, and often talented people diverge even more from other talented people, but just a bunch of weirdos, basically, that makes things seem very different, because the newer artist is also operating in a different time. So that combination of things, XKCD, it's clear where the genesis came from. Part of them, I think, is in like Newgrounds stick figure art.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely a result of Newgrounds.
And so I think XKCD is exciting because it is this transformational thing.
It's like the internet's influence on comic format and on comics in general. I mean, like, infographics certainly existed before the internet, but the internet turned it into like the primary way that information is is communicated.
And he makes them much more. He makes them narrative in a way that's less propagandistic than how they're normally expressed. So I think the thing about XKCD is that even though it's a comic book, a lot of times the statistical ideas he's trying to express are more honestly expressed and more clearly expressed than if a professional math or science writer had tried to do it on CNN or CNBC or whatever. I would like to just point out that this dog smells really bad. I've been wanting to say something about it the whole time, but this dog smells really bad.
Yep.
Okay. So this is the last one. This is by Scott McCloud, who, like I said, I think he's one of the most respected modern comic figures. He's not as flashy, I guess, as maybe some of the current high-profile Marvel or DC writers or whatever, but almost everyone knows who he is. Seems like a pretty cool dude. He's got a defined style, definitely a lot of work put into it. His line work in particular definitely has a style to it. It's actually kind of similar to Jeff Levine's work from earlier, but just sort of better. What I don't like about Scott McCloud's work is the blank color fills. When I see his colored stuff, I really hate blank color fills because I grew up on MS Paint. So I think that for these artists operating in the 90s, they didn't grow up on MS Paint, and so it doesn't stick out to them. It's just like, oh, this is good. Like, I can get these nice neutral colors. I can control. I can see how it's printed. And before, you needed a whole team of people to do coloring. So I think it's more a quirk of mine, just growing up when I did, that I have trouble with flat color washes. To the Moon. Scott McCloud. Poor James Kochalka. I think I know what he was trying to say back in the Comics Journal number 189 with his "Craft is the enemy" letter, but it got kind of garbled. More due to a deficiency in his command of the craft of rhetoric, no dig intended, than a weakness in his basic argument. There are a significant number of young artists who believe that great work is just the inevitable result of the gradual accumulation of skills, and those are the artists James Kochalka said he was talking to. Maybe he deserved a slap or two for slingshotting so far in the other direction, and from no less than Jim Woodring. Ouch. And I'm on the record saying that craft is an inseparable part of the creative process. But in the real world, a lot of comic artists really do put cold skill on a pedestal, and never make those great intuitive leaps that put those skills in perspective. There's no way to skip the hard work of learning our craft. But I hope we haven't given anyone the impression that hard work is all it's going to take. Getting from poor to fair to good to great isn't some kind of straight path of incremental steps. If you're working on your skills every day and just assuming that inspiration will come if you work long enough, you could be waiting for the rest of your life. No one ever reached the moon by becoming a really good mountain climber. And that's the last one. There's a few more on that link. But I like his summation because I think he's sort of acknowledging the reality of the situation and saying there is something behind James Kochalka's argument, but he's just not phrasing it at all, which I think is kind of true. But artists know about artists that get too mechanical or uninspired or...
It also wasn't a problem in comics. I don't know. I didn't see comics coming out that were like incredibly baroque and focused on making like very technical images, but had no depth of writing. I would probably like them.
Heavy metal.
Sure, but the writing in heavy metal is generally they were encouraged to write things that were not the norm for comic books. There was a lot of really interesting, like, new ideas inside of heavy metal.
So I really like what he says about it's not some kind of straight path of incremental steps, and no one ever reached the moon by becoming a really good mountain climber, because I think that heavy metal was so good because people were working in what they thought was an active art field. the European artists that made that like lived as and thought they were artists in a sense that was connected for them with sort of art history. And in America, we're sort of separated from that, or I think more in the 20th century even. Like, we had ideas of pretension to European art, but there's sort of, America's just kind of different. And so I think a lot of the working artists in America were thinking about people who got out of the service and wanted jobs. I think that there is a little bit of difference. But that heavy metal was good because these people didn't think that they were making some confined project, and so a lot of stuff failed, but because it was ambitious, and it didn't fail because it was rote and mechanical.
Right.
And so the thing about not being able to reach the moon by mountain climbing, I feel like so many musicians get hung up by thinking the musicians that they like, that were recording musicians, were a thing that can't be surpassed, or I don't know, maybe more singular than they are, or people get more hung up on people just because so much lip service is paid to them. And I really think you need to be willing to not like music other people don't like, and then like be willing to talk about it, because music isn't just like a background thing for everybody to ignore. Recorded music has made us think that that's the case, but I really think it's to everybody's detriment if people aren't a little bit pickier in the music they want, and they don't try to find people who are shooting for the sky instead of people who are shooting for 10 feet off of the ground.
I also do think that if you set out from your house prepared to climb a mountain and you ended up on the moon, you would have a pretty bad day.
You would have a very bad day. You would be inadequately prepared.
Yeah.
Well, actually, inadequately prepared is great, because a lot of these rock stars, these superstars, were sucked up from really young ages and met like not wonderful ends because they couldn't deal with the level of success.
Right. If you make something good without having the skill to back it up, you can't live up to the expectations that people have of you, and you might just get an echo chamber of yes men telling you that the things that you're making are good and interesting when they aren't necessarily. You're not going to be in the same situation that gave you the inspiration to do something new in the first place. I think maybe understanding a little bit more why it's new or what is new about it is probably very valuable.
Yep. Yeah, I think for like rock artists, the transformation in their life was so massive, and there were just so many people that were trying to make a buck off of them, that I think a lot of what tore apart bands and stuff like that is they had differing financial interests, and they were put into this situation that none of them could really handle. And now, I mean, we've had history and stuff, and also the world's different, and so that's probably unlikely to repeat itself, but it's not something that you should want for anybody. Like, I would much rather just have a lot more people be able to play music than have rock stars. I mean, I just don't... When you look at the music people cover, and you look at the music that continues to do well, so much of it is out of the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So much of this music that keeps getting covered and covered and covered, like Hallelujah, it's not new music. And I think a lot of the songs that stick out to people, it's because they have this powerful storytelling element, like Devil Went Down to Georgia. And sort of the people who managed to do the best, I think, are people who were able to incorporate a storytelling component to almost all of their music. So Johnny Cash stood out compared to other country artists, and it's because a much higher proportion of his songs were about stories and about hardships and death and tragedy, and that was more popular in country music than rock music. And there are other artists like that, but Roger Miller, for instance. But even Roger Miller's stuff had sort of a more traditional bent to it. And Johnny Cash, the individuality and the singularity, and it sort of propelled him to the front. But I think that he's a person who succeeded in a particular commercial environment, and so he happened to be in Sun Records. There were probably other people who could have. I mean, it wasn't exactly a meritocracy, and so the people that stand out for us are the people that play music that they think is meaningful, that they think the words matter. That's why people still like Bob Dylan, is because his like Hurricane tells a story, and a lot of the rap music that really stands out to people, like Stan by Eminem, has like a very strong narrative component. It's sort of this beginning, middle, and end. And
I think that music videos were really important in popularizing rap music that didn't have a strong narrative structure, because frequently the music video would have some sort of like a narrative structure to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, or if there was a weak structure to the song, having a visual illustration of it will fill in all of the blanks, even if the blanks are most of the space. That happened a lot with rock music as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of
the good rock music had a narrative structure as well, up to a certain point. I think prog rock kind of threw a spanner in the cogs there, but like Meatloaf or something, there's a lot of like a strong narrative skeletons going on there.
Billy Joel, yeah.
Iron Maiden songs were frequently about things like there, certainly a weaker narrative structure overall, but Hallowed Be Thy Name is about a person being executed. That's a popular theme in metal music. Metallica has songs about that as well.
I think the reason novelty music often succeeds is because it, under the guise of being novelty music, it basically takes bigger risks and is often more creative.
Like Weird Al or something like that.
Yeah. So, well, I guess that's pretty good. So I guess if I've seen like, or both of us have seen like big old jerks, maybe jelly jerks, I would really encourage you to check out James Kochalka's music, check out my music, play it back to back. I'll put anything I have online.
Try playing it at the same time.
Ooh, that'd be good. It syncs up with Dark Side of the Moon. But seriously, like, actually, I mean, it's just like garsh. It's a great example because it's not like this guy went to like die in poverty. He did fine, and he can do all right. I mean, I think he's pretty much done doing stuff. I haven't seen a lot of stuff from him recently, so Jim Woodring will probably make stuff until he turns into dust. He just put a book out. It was great. It was fantastic, called Poochie Town. Oh my gosh, it was so good. He keeps getting better. And so I guess it really is. I think with art and music, it's just like anything else. You don't take somebody else's word for it. And just see what stuff, speaks to you, or what stuff really resonates with you. And I think a lot of times, it's stuff people put more time into, more thought into. It took more of their day or more of their life. And for me, I know it took a long time to get to the level where I had the confidence in myself. It's like this weird process where you learn your own capabilities, and so that allows you to do better. And I think there's a lot of things that can interrupt that. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm great. So I'm glad. I don't think I'm a superstar, because I think stars are things in the sky. People can't be stars. I don't particularly think that anybody should be like elevated and fetishized and built into a cult of personality And I think that people that seek that out, it's like spooky and creepy to me, because no one actually wants to live the life of Ben Affleck. Like, Ben Affleck does not want to live the life of Ben Affleck. So people might think they do, but when they got there, they would not be pumped for it. Or Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah.
Like, if you are a person who is basically sold as pretty meat, like Leonardo DiCaprio
or if you're just trying to say, I deserve to be famous because I'm better than other people, you're inviting yourself to be criticized constantly in every moment of your life. And I think that that's something that people don't deal with very well for the most part. It seems to be the thing that people who get success complain about, is constantly having people paying attention to everything that they do.
That's sort of what I'm saying, is it's so I think for younger people it's easier to see how, because famous people talk about it all the time. It's just like, it's not desirable to not have privacy. It's not desirable to not be able to check your email because you get 13,000 emails a day and have to get a different cell phone every month. Because people keep finding your number and you're just getting flooded with calls. And so I just think it's this...
And to not be able to trust your friends to actually be your friends, which is like a lamentation that you frequently hear from people who have been successful. Not having people who will give you honest feedback on your work, or having a system to keep you away from people who will give you honest feedback on your work. Just seems like it's not gonna let you make good work, and having friends who can be honest with you and who don't have ulterior motives is like just a very important part of being a human, I think.
So there's like a whole wave of YouTubers who've been successful for a few years now, and I do think that you can see the differences in how these people have kind of lived their lives, and the extent to which they do communicate with their fans or their Discords or whatever, which some of them manage to do even when they have a lot of fans.
Yep.
And so this is I guess my perspective is that I think that you have a chance now to have a much more direct relationship without middlemen, which is excellent. And so from my perspective, it
would be impossible to be Fred Rogers right now, though. Because he would just write back and forth with anybody who wanted to, until one of them died. And he did that. He spent hours every day writing letters to people who had written letters to him. So it seems like it's trying to engage with people on that level would be impossible.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I think it would be preferable if sort of these skills were more dispersed, which I think they are becoming, and I think that this attitude I have is shared amongst other people. But it's just, people do have more of an appreciation of art. I think that younger people have more of an appreciation for just good art, and that they're more willing to say something is good or bad, because that's a lot of often internet culture, which is how young people tend to interact with each other. I'm saying this as if I'm not a young people, but I think that there's a decent difference to being born before smartphones. So smartphones were, I was 17 or something when they became omnipresent, maybe 20.
Yeah, I think it was probably later than 17, honestly.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a different dealio where we're straddling both sides, and I think that, man, it's just nothing. There's so much waste when you want to support someone through a traditional market structure. There's so many middlemen you're dealing with. And I work at a comic book store, and so we're one of the middlemen, and it sucks for us. But I do think that there's some way going forward, if retail survives coronavirus, I do think that there's some way that we can survive in a market that's more where the artists are more directly supported by their patrons. So we have sold products that were Kickstarter funded and stuff like that, and often the Kickstarters just that fills all the demand, but sometimes those things stick around and they keep selling. Scythe is one. I think that was Kickstarted, but there's a lot of board games. So I just want more people to be better, and I want people to write songs I like. And it's okay if you don't like songs like I do, but I think that a lot of people like songs with a strong narrative basis, and a lot of people, I think, would probably agree with my general attitudes towards it, and I think that we could definitely work very quickly into a position where people are more artistically literate, people are more musically literate, and that, I think, will really help people moving forward, because art and music are controlled and used all the time in advertising and all that sort of stuff, and so it's good to think about this stuff. It's not esoteric, and it's not really a waste of time.
I also think that we have an opportunity now to make the stuff that you want to make, and to have less fear of not being able to get it published if it's good. It certainly takes a lot of effort to get your work out there, but when you aren't trying to meet deadlines to produce the stuff that you're producing until it's already established, like that tends to be the way that it works with people who have Patreons. They just kind of can take their time to do their work until they have a schedule that they have to like regularly meet because they've got a lot of people paying them money for it. You're still determining your own schedule at that point, and you've had time to figure out a workflow that works for you, and you just actually don't need to fulfill it most of the time, and people will understand as long as you don't go several months without doing the things that you tell people you'll do. People tend to be more understanding of that than your boss at the comic book factory would be.
Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons this isn't esoteric is because we need to crush it. We need to make all the best art, and we need to continue to rule the world with our superior art, music, and writing. And right now, there is a huge gap in animation, and particularly traditional animation.
Animation just keeps on getting worse.
So there's independent people. So one of the issues with animation is that it sort of has to be collaborative for an animation of any complexity and any length. Otherwise, the person has to spend a ton of time on it. But if we have means that people can work together and organize with each other to form a studio and do collaborative processes, that's the thing I'm most worried about. Is I think most of the people now will probably be self-trained, a lot of the best artists and musicians and writers and stuff. And so I really hope that it can be transitioned into something like an animation industry in a way that we've never seen before, not just Disney or in a couple other studios that are hacking it by. But I really think that we could have a sort of a renaissance, a cultural renaissance, music, art, and film and writing that could be very good for us economically. It could continue to make things better.
And there is a huge void to fill in terms of creating things of quality. I can't help but think of Studio Ghibli and the fact that it's considered to be one of the best animation studios in Japan, and their main dude can't stop directing and making films because if he does, the studio won't be making anything of quality. It seems insane that is the case. That the rest of the stuff that's being made is just the same kind of digitally assisted stuff that's being produced by the rest of the market, just like middling,
or the Witch's Flower, which is just highly derivative of.
But that's another studio, correct? Yeah, and that is very derivative of the Ghibli to the point where it's just not very interesting, it is good that they are trying to make a comparable product. It's much better that exists than to not have it exist. But there just aren't people trying to fill that void. And there is always just going to be a market for a quality product. Particularly now that people have the ability to just create grassroots markets for themselves.
Yeah, so what I was talking about with our culture being the best or whatever is a little tongue-in-cheek, but we're at a stage in human development where people need to decide that the excesses and inefficiencies of our way of doing things is worth the drawbacks, and versus competing world powers. And so I think that increasingly, I'm sure I'll be and everyone will be talking about China, but if we're talking about two competing large industrialized economies, the United States has tons of trouble and tons of problems, and it's done horrible things and is imperialist. But I'm just not convinced the competing power will do well. And I think that art coming out of China looks a lot more like propaganda, whereas you still have stuff coming out of Europe and the United States. And what I hope is that in South America, oh my God, Chile, I've seen some amazing stuff come out of Chile, like art and music. And so I hope that we can build a true internationalism based on this shared language of art. Now that we've had decades, almost everybody in the world has had decades to become used to these storytelling techniques that we use. And I think that we really can build a more unified, like pluralistic world society, and that we have to. And that art is the central component to this. The art and music, because nothing else allows you to sort of bypass people's defenses. If somebody is willing to sit down, or somebody's child is willing to sit down and see a piece of art, and then talk to their parent who's a vicious partisan, and maybe get something across to them. Art it's like this, if everything else is top or bottom, down and up, it's like art has this, it can just go to the side, and it can just sort of turn around and then approach from a different direction that nobody was expecting. And
the idea of censoring your work also for the international market is insane. Like Disney censoring their work for the Chinese market, when the reason that work is desired by the Chinese people to begin with is because it was not created to conform to Chinese culture. Otherwise, they would be making Disney tier movies in China. There's no reason that they wouldn't be. They have the technology. They just don't have the cultural technology. And the institutions just understood why they were doing things the way that they were doing them. And the more that they change their formula to fit into a culture that can't produce a Disney Studios, the worse the output is going to be.
If the people who are hiring your animators and your writers and your filmmakers don't have an understanding of artistic literacy,
of why they would want to hire one person over another person,
it's going to be very hard for them to get good people to work with them, and it's going to be difficult to have a deep, fine appreciation for all of these arts and be a party official without engaging in the deepest doublethink. And so, while some of them are probably able to do it, it's I just don't think. There are some special effects wonders that have come out of Chinese cinema recently, but the thrust behind them it's like nationalistic. It's even some ways even more boardroom, because the boardroom idea here is just like whatever crazy thing will work, and the boardroom thing over there is whatever fits in with the Chinese Communist Party's like overarching thesis at the time. So, well, this has been a long one. I'm going to have to edit until my face falls off, I think. Not cutting us out, but putting all these awesome things in, all these overlays.
I did have a couple nip slips that I would like you to remove.
I've been asked about, first of all, leave any comments if you want to. I've been asked about releasing this as audio. This one in particular, I think, would be very difficult to follow if you weren't looking at it, because we've shown so many artists' works. So I'm kind of hesitant. I might just rip the MP3 and then put a link to it in the description. But as far as like populating the services with it, I don't know. I guess I got a lot of stuff going on. But if people want us to do that, I can probably do it. I do hate Apple, though.
Let us know what you think in the comments below.
Let us leave a zone in my friend comment.
Find a bell and smash it.
Bleh. Bleh. Bleh.
Take this symbol and apply it to my friend zone.